Welcome to 23 Degrees Sideways, Coyote in the Highlands. I'm in the temper tent today because I want you to be able to hear me, and I don't have a proper microphone I can plug into this camera yet that'll do all the audio stuff. Working on that. Technology beyond the dirt stage is difficult. We're going to talk a little bit today. I tried to do a video about this before, but I was in the truck and it just ended up being way too noisy. We're going to talk about shade and wind. This is going to be pretty relevant to anyone who's homesteading, I don't know, west of the Mississippi, certainly west of the Rockies, but maybe down into Texas, eastern New Mexico, that stuff too. And we're talking about wind and shade. I wanted to get this done before I get past the building phase where it's like really on my mind, like how you have to deal with these two things. The summertime here, this is what you would call highlands, high desert in Arizona, and this is true high desert. I have saguaro cactus, I have prickly pears, I have ocotillo, I have juniper trees. Near me, there are some palo verdes. I don't have any on this property. I have Joshua trees. I'll probably plant some palo verdes and see if I can get some mesquite going as I get the water systems set up. But this is the interface between the Sonora and Mojave deserts, which is why the species are so interesting. And we're high. We're at 3,100, 3,200 feet. And that's not the... There's a lot of people who say things about high desert and they're talking about something completely different, the Great Basin. This is actual elevated desert. That's all I really wanted to get at with that. And the temperatures here are going to get into 105, maybe 110 on the extremes in the summer, but a lot of it's going to float in between 90 and 100, like a whole lot of the summer. And that's perfectly fine, and there's nothing wrong with it. The humidity is relatively low. We tend to get some breezes. We'll talk about wind later. You know, and some of the hot days are relatively still. But it's very survivable, and there's really no problems with it if you have shade. Shade is life out here. And you'll look at the older native populations. They had huge ramada shade structures. They'd use ocotillo and saguaro, the ribs from the saguaro, the spines, the, I don't know, trunk, whatever you want to call it. We call them saguaro bones. And they'd cut ocotillo and they'd make huge shade structures. And that basically is how they lived. And then you get to a little bit more in the northeastern part, you get the Navajo with the hogans, octagonal buildings, much more solid walls, and that has to do more with the wind. But big, large, open shade structures, okay? Relatively open. If you've ever been in a hogan, they're not actually really that small and dark. There's some smaller ones, but they tend to be fairly open. And traveling-wise, if you guys ever go to Grand Canyon West, which is a reservation-run Grand Canyon, they have a skywalk, and they're open and allow people to do stuff, because I don't know what the reservations are currently doing with the after effects of the pandemic from 2 years ago, whatever. They have some pretty neat rebuilt stuff, different shelters from this area, and you can take a look and see what's going on. Shade is life, so if you have shade, everything becomes much more comfortable. So the first priority here is to get shade, preferably waterproof shade, because while it's fine to just run shade cloth at this season, monsoons are coming. I've got, what, 4 months? 5 months? I need some real roof. You can get dumped on a couple inches in a day during monsoon season, so you really want to be ready for that. You want to at least have the fragile, perishable, water-damaged stuff under cover, all right? It's a large part of why the temper tent, I think, is going to stay if I can get a cover over the roof. We'll talk about that in the temper tent videos. So get shade. That's going to be the biggest thing out here. It's even a big deal in the East. It's just that you tend to have a lot of trees around, or the Pacific Northwest. You have a lot of trees around, and it's not hard to find a shady spot to sit. You know, where I'm at, the junipers tend to get up to, 6-8 feet. There's not a lot of canopy there. You know, down in the washes there are some. I'm going to be trimming some up and trying to make some spaces. But right now that's not how it goes. And of course I have this scraped area for construction, which is more scraped than I wanted, but I wasn't the one doing the work, and I wasn't running the machine, so there's no shade there. That's one of the reasons the outdoor kitchen is being built the way it is because I need to get the initial shade and then be able to expand the shaded area. I'm not so worried about being under cover in the sense of having an insulated, indoor, airtight, modern area. That's unhealthy. It's bad airflow. It's great for diseases and respiratory illness, and it's not good for anything else. So, shade and wind. One of the things that you'll find is that some days are calm, some days are windy. If you look at the map right now, as I'm recording this, pretty much everything south of Burns, Oregon, and west of Albuquerque is predicted this weekend to have 15 to 45 mile an hour winds. Pretty much everywhere. Okay, you look at a map and it shows everything. It's like Topak, Kingman, Lake Havasu, Needles, Mojave, which is in California, San Diego, Reno. Everything is going to have tons and tons of wind. So that's something you have to deal with, and it's periodic. And sometimes you have the morning and afternoon winds. That's if you've ever lived on the coast, you're used to that. But in the desert, you get that also, where the morning air is warming and just causes wind. And out here, sometimes at night, with the thermal changes from the large rock masses and stuff coming out of the northern peaks, because up north of us, it keeps getting steadily higher, and there's an 8,000-foot peak. So even though we're very low at 3,100 feet, which isn't that low, but it's very low for the Mountain West, we get the winds coming down out of the mountains sometimes at night, and they'll hit the yurt from the northeast at 20 to 30 miles an hour and just, well, they wake you up a little bit. So wind protection is another thing. Wind comes with dust, and if you're in the west, dust is part of how this works. Okay, it's part of life. You can control it. You can moderate it a lot. Permaculture will help. Swales, modify hedgerows. Modifying the wind patterns will help. There's a lot of stuff you can do, but dust is a thing. So protecting against a wind has two basic factors. One is to make sure that you have good, solid wind walls for your living space, so that you can get out of it, so that your stuff doesn't blow away, okay? If you leave something outside and it doesn't weigh 100 pounds, it will eventually blow away. If it weighs 100 pounds and it has 300 feet of surface area, it's gonna blow away. You know, this stuff happens. So condense your stuff into spots that are wind protected. Wind protection's a big deal. Work on that, wind and shade. And I'm not trying to tell you how to do the wind protection right now. Building cabins is great. I prefer dirt and earth and stone and concrete and cinder block because I like to have a really firm space. Also because the wind will leach in the winter. It'll leach the heat out of anything doesn't have a solid thermal mass. I'm a thermal mass advocate rather than an insulation advocate. We'll get into that later. I just want to talk about that because that's what I'm doing right now. I'm working on that a lot. The wind stuff is coming after the shade stuff because the yurt is surviving all the windstorms. The temper tent is surviving all the windstorms. So I have spaces. Okay, it's a little noisy if there's a real windstorm because they are fabric-ish structures, and they just, you can hear them, okay? I have a solid metal trailer for some of the tools and stuff also, but it's very small. It's too small to use as a sleeping space. So I'm working on shade first. Shade equals life. If it's 105 degrees outside and there's any hint of breeze and you're in the shade, you're fine. You're comfortable. If you're sitting down to drink something cool, like some water, and you have a little mister spray bottle or something, and it's 105 and you're in the shade, you're fine. Shade is the key. Shade is life, and that's what we're working on first. If you are doing this, if you're doing the budget escape property version of homesteading out here where you can get land relatively cheap, what you want to do is you want to get some poles, any kind of poles that you can, but you need thick poles. 3-inch for an 8 or 10 foot pole, 4-inch for a 12 foot to 16 foot pole. Get them in the ground, get them concrete anchored. Somehow you got a concrete anchor. I would go a little bit below grade and then stack some cinder blocks and concrete the whole thing, whatever it is. Make sure that you have poles, concrete anchored. Metal poles, EMT tubing will work just fine. Just get it metal anchored and get a ridge beam, and then get some shade cloth up. Get some taller poles, anchor them really well, and put some tension spikes on them. You know, pound some fence stakes in and pull some tension ropes and put a shade sail up. It's got to be windproof shade, but you need shade, and you need it bigger and lower than you think because the sun moves all the way across the sky. So if you've got a 10 by 10 shade structure and it's 8 feet up, you've got 2 hours of shade in the day because the sun moves around like that. Maybe 4 hours. It depends on how you move your chairs and stuff. So what you want is to have it, the main part up at a decent walking height, and then you want to have some sides, especially to the southeast and southwest, moving into the west. Afternoon sun in the, we're at a relatively high latitude, you know, you're talking about 30 to 40 degrees north, most of this spaces. And so the sun in the summer is going to set relatively close to the northwest, not directly west. It's going to get it pretty north. So that whole western slanted shade, get it slanted down so that you can, well, live. You can make it a roll-up. You can use roll-up screens, whatever it is. Make the shade. Just make the shade. That's going to save your life out here, and it's probably more important than a lot of the construction stuff that people think of. Another factor about shade is if you're living in a low temporary shelter like a yurt or a smaller tent or even a canned ham trailer, if your shade is tall enough, even a cabin, and your shade is over your living structure, it's going to keep your living structure much, much cooler. Okay, you're going to get the wind flow, you're going to have airflow where the heat rises instead of the heat going to be baked by the sun. It's a much more comfortable way to live. It's one of the reasons out here you see people with trailers with roofs over the trailer. It's not as much a rain problem as it is a shade problem, and it just really helps a lot. So that's the basic video. I want to talk about that before I got too far down the road on building this stuff and showing you what I'm building. Stay sideways.